The dawn of December 13, 1943, broke over the jagged green hills of Assam, India, with deceptive calm. At Denjan Airfield, the vital humming nerve center for the perilous Hump airlift, the morning mist clung to the jungle canopy. For Second Lieutenant Philip Adair, a 23-year-old pilot from Pennsylvania, it was just another patrol mission in a long, grinding campaign. He strapped himself into the cockpit of his Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, a machine already past its prime, nicknamed Lulu Bell and marked with the bold number 44. At 9:27 a.m., the roar of his Allison V-1710-81 engine shattered the quiet as he lifted Lulu Bell into the humid sky for his 44th combat mission. Adair was no novice. As part of the 89th Fighter Squadron, nicknamed the Burma Banshees, his job for months had been to protect the lumbering C-47 Skytrains that ran the Hump, the treacherous air route over the eastern Himalayas into China. This aerial lifeline was the only way to keep Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's forces supplied, a strategic imperative for the Allies. But it was a route paid for in blood and aluminum. Japanese fighters and bombers, operating from bases in occupied Burma, had made the skies a hunting ground and the airfields tempting, static targets. The previous 8 weeks had been a nightmare for Allied logistics in northeast India. A series of daring Japanese raids had caught transports on the ground, leaving 47 aircraft destroyed and 112 personnel dead in flaming wreckage. The threat was constant, the pressure immense. Every takeoff was a gamble. On this morning, that gamble rested solely on Philip Adair's shoulders. As he banked into a climbing turn, the radio crackled to life in his headphones, with a tense, urgent call from the Denjan control tower. A massive radar contact was painting a grim picture to the east. Through the thinning morning haze, Adair saw them materialize like a swarm of dark insects, a formidable formation of Japanese aircraft, their silhouettes hardening against the rising sun. He quickly counted, his stomach tightening. 24 twin-engine Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers flying in disciplined, deadly V formations. Surrounding and stacked above them in layered escort were approximately 40 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters, agile, ruthless, and proven killers of the China-Burma-India Theater. 64 enemy aircraft. The math was horrifyingly simple. Standard U.S. Army Air Force's doctrine was clear. When outnumbered more than 5 to 1, a fighter pilot was to avoid engagement, shadow the enemy, and wait for reinforcements. Adair's odds were 64 to 1. He was not just outnumbered, he was alone. The nearest friendly fighters were based at Jorhat, a full 38 minutes of flight time away. By the time they arrived, Denjan would be a cratered, burning ruin. He scanned his instrument panel, a ritual of grim assessment. His internal fuel tanks were full, 180 gallons, giving him about 90 minutes of flight time at combat power. His 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns were loaded, but he knew their grim limitation. At a cyclic rate of over 800 rounds per minute, all 6 guns together carried only enough ammunition for about 12 seconds of sustained fire. 12 seconds to change the course of a battle. Below him, Denjan Airfield was utterly exposed and packed with value. Intelligence reports had indicated that similar-sized Japanese raids on undefended airfields in Burma had achieved a 90% destruction rate. On Denjan's pierced steel planking sat 14 fully loaded C-47 transports, their bellies stuffed with ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies destined for China. A field hospital, marked with red crosses that offered no guarantee of safety from the air, treated 63 wounded soldiers. Fuel bladders, fat and vulnerable, held enough precious aviation gas to support Hump operations for 11 days. The destruction of Denjan would sever the aerial artery to China for weeks, potentially collapsing the entire forward strategy in the region. The Japanese formation was 3,000 feet below him, cruising at 240 miles per hour on a direct bearing for the airfield. They had not yet seen him. Their focus was fixed forward on their target. In that moment, Philip Adair stood at a solitary crossroads. The rational choice was to radio the warning, climb for altitude and sun, and track the formation from a safe distance, a witness to the coming destruction. He would be blameless by the book. But the book didn't account for what was on the ground. It didn't account for the wounded in the hospital tents or the ground crews who serviced his plane. It didn't account for the lifeline to China. In his headphones, he could almost hear the clock ticking down to 0. If the bombers reached their release point unimpeded, the bombs would fall with mechanical certainty. Adair's hand moved to the throttle quadrant. He pushed the thick, ball-ended throttle lever forward through the gate into war emergency power. The Allison engine behind him responded with a deep-throated screaming crescendo. The manifold pressure needle climbed to 54 inches of mercury. Lulu Bell surged forward, accelerating to 320 mph. He didn't radio for help. He didn't turn away. He began a climbing turn to position himself 4,000 feet above the bomber stream, maneuvering to come out of the south with the blinding morning sun directly at his back, a classic fighter pilot's advantage. His mind raced, formulating a plan as audacious as it was desperate. He couldn't shoot down 64 aircraft, but perhaps he didn't have to. His target was not the fighters, but the formation of the bombers. His goal was disruption, not destruction. If he could break apart their tight Vs, scatter them, force them to jink and evade, their bombing accuracy would disintegrate. They might be compelled to abort or drop their payloads harmlessly into the endless jungle. It was a slim chance, a tactical nuisance against overwhelming force. But it was the only chance Denjan had. The lead Sally bomber group flew ahead, 6 aircraft in 2 perfect tight Vs of 3. They were the key. As he rolled his P-40 inverted and pulled the nose down into a screaming dive, the airspeed building rapidly past 360 mph. One question must have echoed in his mind, a question he had no time to answer. Could one obsolete warhawk, one pilot, truly disrupt an entire Japanese raid? The sun glinted off his canopy. The roar of the wind and engine filled the world. The point of no commitment was now far behind him. The attack was on. The world compressed into a tunnel of screaming wind, vibrating metal, and the overwhelming scent of oil and adrenaline. From his 7 o'clock high position, Philip Adair watched the bomber formation grow from toy-like specks into detailed, vulnerable giants. His dive was near vertical, the airspeed indicator needle quivering past 360 miles per hour, pushing towards the P-40's red line. The Allison engine shrieked in protest, a mechanical howl that vibrated through the airframe and into his bones. In the cockpit, the G-forces of the dive pressed him gently but firmly into his seat, a strange, quiet pressure before the storm. Below, the Japanese formation continued its relentless, straight-line march toward Denjan, oblivious. The escorting Oscars, layered high and low, maintained their patrol boxes, their attention still fixed forward. For a few more precious seconds, he held the element of surprise. This was the critical asymmetry. The Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar was a Predator built for close-quarters slaughter. With its lightweight construction, a Nakajima Ha-115 engine producing 1,150 horsepower, and revolutionary butterfly combat flaps, it could turn inside any Allied fighter in the theater. Over the past 6 months, these agile killers had claimed 63 Allied aircraft over Burma and northeast India, perfecting a tactic of luring heavier, faster opponents into turning fights where the Oscar's superior maneuverability became a death sentence. American pilots had learned the hard lesson: never turn with an Oscar. The P-40's doctrine was boom and zoom, use its superior dive speed and heavier armament to make slashing attacks, then extend away using straight-line speed to reset. But today, extending away was a luxury Adair could not afford. If he broke off, the bombers would simply reform and continue. His entire strategy was a violation of standard tactics. He had to remain in the kill zone, a persistent, stinging threat, accepting the turning fight he knew he couldn't win in order to prevent a greater catastrophe on the ground. At 800 yards, the lead Sally bomber filled his reflector sight. He could see the glint of its cockpit glass, the geometric patterns of its camouflage. His thumb rested on the firing button on the control stick. He took a final instinctive check. Fuel, pressure, temperature. All nominal for now. He waited, letting the range close, ignoring the instinct to fire early. He needed maximum impact, a shock to the system. 600 yards. 500. The bombers were still rigid in formation. At 400 yards, he fired. The sound was not a rat-tat-tat, but a deep shuddering brrrr that shook the entire aircraft. 6 streams of 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds converged from his wing-mounted guns. Bright orange tracers, one for every 5th round, arced ahead like deadly fireflies, walking swiftly up the line of his sight. He saw the rounds connect, a line of tiny, sudden flashes stitching a brutal path up the left wing of the lead Sally. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The bomber's thin aluminum skin, designed for lightness not protection, offered no resistance. Fabric on the control surfaces shredded into confetti. Sparks of metal bloomed where rounds struck structural members. Then, the key hit. The port-side Mitsubishi Ha-101 radial engine erupted. A flash of orange fire swallowed the engine cowling, followed by a thick, greasy plume of black smoke that streamed back, whipping over the bomber's tail. The perfect V formation shattered like a pane of glass hit by a stone. The stricken leader lurched violently to the left. The other 5 bombers in the element instinctively broke in all directions, their pilots yanking their controls to avoid collision and the terrifying spectacle of their leader's demise. The disciplined bombing run dissolved into chaos in under 3 seconds. Adair hauled back on the stick with all his strength, pulling out of the dive. The G-forces now slammed him down into his seat, a crushing, gray-out-inducing weight of over 7 Gs. Blood drained from his head. His vision tunneled. He fought the pressure, grunting against it, rolling sharply to the right to scan the sky as he climbed. The tactical triumph was immediately eclipsed by the tidal wave of retaliation. The sky around him exploded with movement. The 40 Oscars, finally alerted, were no longer a distant escort screen, but a converging wave of anger. They shed altitude like hawks, their sleek, green-brown frames tipping into dives from multiple directions. Adair's first attackers, a showtie of 4 Oscars in the classic Finger 4 formation, came from his 10 o'clock high. He could see the red Hinomaru on their wings, the closed canopies. They had the angle. He had speed. He rolled left, pulled the nose up into a climbing turn towards them. a feint. As the lead Oscar committed to matching his turn, Adair stomped on the right rudder, skidded the nose, and fired a desperate 2-second burst. The tracers sailed high and wide. The Oscar pilot, disciplined, broke off his attack sharply to the right, his wingman following. Adair didn't wait. He reversed again, shoving the stick forward to dive away, trading the precious altitude he'd just gained for the one thing that could save him: velocity. The P-40, heavier and more robust, accelerated in the dive like a falling anvil. 2 more Oscars tried to intercept his dive path from above. He saw their muzzle flashes first, tiny, harmless-looking winks of light. Then the 7.7mm tracers reached out, lazy and slow-seeming until they flashed past his canopy with lethal speed. He jerked into a climbing left turn, firing another snapshot. No hits. His ammunition counter, a small grim dial, now showed only 800 rounds remaining across all 6 guns. At his rate of fire, that was perhaps 6 more 1-second bursts. He was burning through his lifeblood at a terrifying rate. A glance over his shoulder revealed the deeper, more critical battle. Behind the swirling dogfight of fighters, the scattered Sally bombers were not fleeing. With a stubborn, disciplined persistence, they were attempting to regroup. 3 distinct groups of 6 aircraft each were slowly turning, trying to claw their way back into a cohesive bombing formation. The raid was damaged, but not defeated. If those V's reformed, they would press on to Denjan. Adair estimated he had 90 seconds, maybe less, before they reached their bomb release point. He couldn't fight the Oscars and stop the bombers. He had to choose. Ignoring 2 more Oscars diving on his tail, he rolled out of his turn, shoved the throttle back to the firewall, and pointed Lulu Bell's nose down in a second, screaming dive. Not at the fighters, but straight through their screen toward the regrouping bombers. 8 Oscars took the bait and followed him down. The P-40, in its element, accelerated past 400 mph in the dive, the airframe shuddering from the strain. The lighter Oscars, with less mass to convert to speed, began to fall behind. Adair opened a small, vital gap. He pulled out of the dive hard at bomber altitude, his wings groaning, and found himself lined up on the right-hand Sally group that had almost reformed. Range: 300 yards. He didn't have time for a careful aim. He centered the lead bomber in his sight and depressed the trigger. Another hammer blow of sound and vibration. This time, the .50 caliber rounds converged on the bomber's right side engine. The result was even more catastrophic. The radial engine didn't just catch fire, it exploded. A fireball of burning fuel and shrapnel bloomed from the wing root. The Sally instantly rolled onto its back, a flaming meteor, pieces of wing and tail tearing away. Its wingman, flying perilously close, yanked his aircraft into a violent brake to avoid the fireball and flying debris. Adair was now a vortex of chaos within the raid. He kicked rudder, skidding his smoking guns left, and hosed another bomber with a short burst. The rounds punched straight through the Ki-21's unarmored fuselage. He knew from intelligence briefings that the Sally, designed in the mid-1930s, had no protective armor for its crew and no self-sealing fuel tanks. It was a flying coffin if hit, but it could still carry its 2,200 pounds of bombs to the target. Then, the bill came due. 12 Oscars, having regrouped and now furious, were closing on him from the rear and sides, cutting off his escape routes. His fuel gauge read 162 gallons. Ammunition, 650 rounds. The bombers were now 19 miles from Denjan. He had 4 minutes. And then a new insidious enemy announced itself. On his instrument panel, the coolant temperature needle, which had been hovering at the high edge of normal, began a steady, inexorable climb past 230 degrees Fahrenheit. The Allison V-1710 was a liquid-cooled engine, a masterpiece of complexity that relied on a tightly regulated system of coolant circulating through its block and a radiator under the fuselage. At continuous war emergency power, it generated furnace-like heat. The system was designed to handle it for about 20 minutes. Adair had been at full throttle for just over 11. At 250 degrees, the engine would begin to fail. Pistons would swell. Bearings would seize. He was caught in a triple bind. An overheating engine, dwindling ammunition, and a bomber stream that, though battered, was still advancing. He could reduce power and save his engine, abandoning the attack. He could flee for home, or he could continue, knowing he was now not only fighting the Japanese, but also racing the mechanical death of his own aircraft. Below, the jungle was enemy territory. A forced landing or bailout there meant capture or death. The coolant gauge ticked to 235. The lead bomber formation was 17 miles out. They were within range. Adair kept the throttle forward. The descent was no longer a matter of control, but of negotiation with a disintegrating machine. At 4,000 feet, the final pretense of normal flight ended. The right aileron control cable, frayed and stressed beyond its limits by bullets and violent maneuvers, snapped with a soundless finality that registered only as a sudden, catastrophic loss of pressure in the control stick. The aileron itself, now a free-floating piece of metal, slammed to its full downward deflection. The effect was instantaneous and violent. Lulu Bell's right wing dropped, as if slapped down by a giant's hand. The nose, following the wing, sliced downward into a steep, accelerating dive. Adair reacted instinctively, hauling back on the control stick with both hands, every muscle in his shoulders and back straining against the forces pulling him into the jungle canopy that now filled his windscreen. Nothing happened. The stick moved with a sickening, spongy looseness. The elevator cables, damaged in the same fuselage burst that had brought smoke into the cockpit, had finally given up. He had no pitch control. The nose stayed down, locked in its death sentence. The airspeed, bled away just moments before, now began to climb again with awful gravity-fed purpose. 200 map, 20, 250. The jungle, a textured green rug from altitude, resolved into individual trees, then into a rushing, snarling wall of vegetation. The altimeter unwound with heart-stopping speed. 3,000 feet, 2,500, 2,000. The roar of the wind was deafening. The 6 Oscars circling above became distant, silent specks. This was it. After surviving 64 enemy aircraft, after pushing a dying engine beyond all mechanical logic, he would die in a matter of seconds, crashing into the very jungle he had saved from bombardment. In that vortex of noise, vibration, and certain death, a spark of clarity fired in the oxygen-starved, carbon monoxide-fogged recesses of his brain. It wasn't a memory from a manual. It was a deeper, almost visceral understanding of the physics holding him and failing him. Aerodynamics work in both directions. The damaged right aileron, forcing the wing down, was an aerodynamic input. The horizontal stabilizer, stuck in a nose-down position, was another. These inputs were killing him in right-side-up flight. But what if he reversed the aircraft's relationship to those forces? What if the inputs that were dragging him down could be made to pull him up? The idea was insane. It defied every procedure, every instinct, every ounce of conventional piloting wisdom. but conventional wisdom had run out of answers 10 minutes ago. At 1,800 feet, a mere 6 seconds from impact at his current descent rate, Philip Adair made a decision that transcended training and entered the realm of pure instinctual survival. He applied left stick and rudder. The dying P-40, still hurtling earthward at over 250 mph, responded with a sluggish, groaning roll. The horizon, a blur of green and blue, tilted, slid across the canopy, and vanished. The jungle swapped places with the sky. The world turned upside down. The sensation was immediate and profound. Negative G-force slammed him upward against his shoulder harness. The straps dug in brutally. Every loose object in the cockpit, a pencil, a chart, dust, floated upward toward what was now the ceiling. The blood rushed to his head, a pounding, pressurized surge that turned his vision crimson at the edges. He was hanging in his straps, looking up at the jungle rushing toward him, while the sky was now a terrifying abyss below his feet. But the aircraft responded. The damaged right aileron, which had been forcing the right wing down, was now, in the inverted attitude, forcing it up. The horizontal stabilizer, locked in a nose-down trim for upright flight, was now acting to push the tail down relative to the inverted aircraft, which meant it was lifting the nose up. The very damage that had condemned him was now, perversely, saving him. The nose, obeying this new, reversed logic, began to rise. The terrifying descent rate slowed from over 4,000 feet per minute to 2,000, then 1,500. At 1,200 feet, just a few hundred feet above the tallest trees, the P-40 leveled out. He was flying, upside down, at 140 miles per hour. The engine, the dying Allison, coughed and sputtered violently. The fuel system, designed for positive G-loads, struggled to feed fuel to the carburetor from tanks now above the engine. It gasped, threatened to quit, then caught again, running rougher than ever, but producing just enough power to maintain this impossible equilibrium. For 40 seconds, Adair held the inverted attitude, climbing slowly at a pathetic 50 feet per minute, clawing back the sky he had nearly thrown away. His world was a disorienting diorama. The jungle was a ceiling he was crawling away from. The instrument panel was a confusing array of dials whose orientations made no sense. The slipstream howled through the open canopy above his head. Then, the fuel starvation problem returned, with a vengeance. The engine began to sag, missing beats. He was losing power. He had no choice. He rolled the aircraft back to right side up. The moment the wings leveled, the damaged controls reasserted their deadly command. The right wing dropped, the nose dove. The altimeter began unwinding again, 600 feet per minute down. He had found a terrible, exhausting rhythm. It was not flight. It was a desperate aerial gymnastics routine for one. Flip, climb, flip, descend. He would roll inverted, nurse the nose up, gain 200 precious feet while fighting the negative G's and the engine's protests. Then, as fuel flow faltered, he would roll upright, let the engine gasp and feed properly for a few seconds as he lost 300 feet. And then, before the dive could accelerate, roll inverted again to repeat the cycle. For 11 minutes, Philip Adair flew this way. A grotesque, wavering sine wave painted across the sky over the Burmese jungle. Up and down, inverted and upright, a man engaged in a brutal wrestling match with Newtonian physics, using the enemy's own weapons, his aircraft's mortal wounds, as his only tools. The 6 Oscar pilots circling above watched this spectacle in what must have been utter disbelief. The American P-40, trailing a pathetic banner of smoke and steam with a clearly dead or dying engine, was not crashing. It was performing a macabre, impossible dance. It would fly upside down, then flip erratically right side up, then back again, each time clawing a few more feet from gravity's grasp. It was the determination of a mortally wounded animal refusing to fall, a display of sheer, stubborn will that transcended the mechanics of aerial combat. One of the Oscar pilots, perhaps driven by curiosity or a need to confirm the insanity, finally broke from the circle and dove down for a closer look. Adair, his vision swimming, saw the green shape dropping toward him from the sky, which was below him as he was inverted at that moment. With a coolness born of utter desperation, he completed his inverted climb, then rolled sharply upright, directly into the path of the diving Oscar. It was a bluff of magnificent proportions. He had no ammunition, marginal control, and a screaming engine, but he pointed the nose of his crippled warhawk straight at the Japanese fighter. The Oscar pilot, faced with what appeared to be either a suicidal ramming attempt or the actions of a man possessed by demons, broke away violently. The message from the remaining Oscars was clear. This American was no longer a tactical target. He was a phenomenon, a force of nature. Engaging him further was pointless, perhaps even perilous in its strangeness. One by one, they turned their noses east toward Burma and departed. The sky at last was empty of enemies. Alone, Adair continued his agonizing, rolling journey toward Nguli. The immediate threat was gone, but the fundamental equation was unchanged. He was still in a dying aircraft, flying a pattern that demanded superhuman concentration and physical endurance. His fuel gauge showed 83 gallons he couldn't properly use. His oil pressure gauge had been pegged at 0 for 9 minutes. By all rights, the engine's internals should have welded themselves into a solid, seized mass. That it still ran was a minor miracle, a testament to the ruggedness of the Allison and the thin, burning film of oil still clinging to its dying components. He was no longer a fighter pilot. He was a test pilot in the most horrific experiment imaginable, proving that an aircraft could be flown home not in spite of its damage, but by using its damage in a way its designers never dreamed. The inverted world had become his only path to survival. The rolling, agonizing ballet continued for miles, a grim testament to human endurance against mechanical oblivion. Flip, climb, flip, descend. Each cycle was a gamble with gravity and fuel starvation. A few hundred feet won, then reluctantly surrendered. Yet slowly, agonizingly, the altimeter needle crept upward. 3,000 feet, then 4,000. The familiar landmarks of friendly territory began to appear beneath the inverted and right-side-up world of his cockpit. A winding brown river, a cleared hillside. Ahead, a desperate hope took shape. The distant, faint geometric lines of Nguli Airfield, 21 miles southwest, 11 minutes away, if his bizarre flight pattern could maintain forward progress. Inside the dying Warhawk, the environment was a chamber of horrors. The cockpit air was a toxic brew of scorched metal, vaporized coolant, and now the insidious, odorless poison of carbon monoxide seeping from the damaged engine and burning electrical wires. Adair's head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. His vision had begun to tunnel, gray curtains encroaching from the periphery, narrowing the world to the few essential instruments and the slice of horizon he needed to see for his next role. His reactions were slowing, his thoughts becoming viscous. The blood tests later would confirm it. He had been flying with severe, incapacitating levels of carbon monoxide poisoning for the final 11 minutes of the flight. At that concentration, he should have been unconscious. That he was not was a function of pure, distilled will, of a mind refusing to relinquish command. The engine, the long-suffering Allison, was now running on a combination of momentum, prayer, and the microscopic ghosts of lubrication. Its sound was a ragged, uneven cacophony, backfires, metallic grinding, long, wheezing exhalations. The coolant temperature gauge's needle had melted off its post, a small, silent testament to the inferno that had raged within. Smoke still poured from the cowling seams, but the open flames had subsided, either starved of fuel or having burned everything combustible in the engine bay. It was a corpse being forced to move. At 5,000 feet, Nguli resolved from a smudge into a real place. The straight slash of the runway, the blocky control tower, the earthen revetments meant to protect aircraft. Safety. A profound, almost painful wave of relief threatened to break his concentration. But it was immediately followed by a cold, tactical assessment of new and critical problems. The battle was not over. It had merely changed its form. First, the landing gear. The P-40's gear was hydraulically actuated. The hydraulic pump was driven by the engine. His engine was producing less than 40% of its normal power, its revolutions faltering. If he lowered the gear and the hydraulic pump failed, or the engine quit completely, the drag from the extended gear would turn his already poor glide into a stone's fall. He would crash short of the runway. If he kept the gear up and attempted a wheels-up belly landing on the rough strip, the impact would likely rupture his remaining fuel tanks, turning Lulubelle into a fireball upon touchdown. He needed the gear down, and he needed it down before the engine made its final, inevitable sigh. His right hand, shaking not from fear, but from the neurological effects of carbon monoxide, reached for the small, familiar lever on the left side of the cockpit. He pulled it to the down position. He listened for the whine of motors, the thump of locks. Nothing. Only the howl of the wind and the death rattle of the engine. The hydraulic pressure gauge confirmed it. The needle barely flickered. The pump, starved of power, was incapable of moving the heavy landing gear against the 160 mph slipstream. A backup existed. A manual hand pump, a chrome-plated lever, mounted on the cockpit's left wall, near his knee. The manual proclaimed it required 28 full strokes to build sufficient pressure to lower the gear. It was a two-handed operation, demanding significant physical force. Adair looked at the control stick, held in a precarious neutral by his constant pressure. Letting go meant the damaged aileron and elevator would immediately command a dive. He looked at the pump. He looked at the runway, now 7 miles away. 3 minutes. Improvisation was now his primary skill. Unbuckling his lap belt with one clumsy hand, he pulled the long, heavy canvas strap loose. Leaning forward against the negative G's of an inverted phase, he looped the belt around the base of the control stick, then through a sturdy part of the seat frame and pulled it back tight, knotting it with fumbling fingers. It was a crude, desperate lashing. He took his hand off the stick. The aircraft wobbled, the nose dipped slightly, but the makeshift rig held it in an approximation of level flight. It would have to do. Now, both hands free, he grabbed the cold metal handle of the manual pump. Each stroke was a battle. The hydraulic fluid, likely thinned by heat and loss of pressure, offered little resistance at first. He pumped, his arms burning with fatigue, his breath coming in ragged gasps of toxic air. 5 strokes. 10. The gray tunnel in his vision narrowed further. 15. He could feel a faint, viscous resistance building in the pump. 20. His muscles screamed. 23. A definite solid pressure pushed back against the handle. 25. 26. 27. On the 28th stroke, a deep, solid thump resonated through the airframe, a sound more beautiful than any symphony. Outside, the left main landing gear, then the right, grudgingly extended and locked into place. The nose gear followed. It was done. But the victory came at a cost. The drag from the 3 extended wheels was immense. His airspeed, already marginal, bled away from 160 mph to 135. He was now barely 15 miles per hour above the Warhawk's stall speed. The added drag also demanded more power from the engine to maintain altitude, power it did not have. The engine's ragged song grew even more strained. Nguli was 3 miles ahead. 2 minutes. Second, the approach. The tower operators at Nguli, watching through binoculars, saw the familiar silhouette of a P-40 approaching, trailing its pathetic banner of smoke. They saw the gear come down, a standard signal for a landing. They assumed a normal, if damaged, approach. Lower flaps on final, reduced speed, a smooth touchdown. They did not know that Adair's flaps were also hydraulic. The manual pump was for the gear alone. He had no means to lower the flaps. A flapless landing meant a much higher approach speed, 120 mph instead of 90. It meant a longer landing roll on a runway that was 4,000 feet long. He would need every inch of it. Third, the final betrayal. At 2 miles from the runway threshold, with the concrete strip a beautiful beckoning gray ribbon ahead, the Allison V-1710-81 engine uttered its final, choked gasp. The propeller, a blur of metal, slowed, then stopped, settling into a stark, windmilling X against the sky. The roar that had been the constant soundtrack of his existence for the past hour vanished, replaced by an eerie, whistling silence. The P-40 was now a glider. A very poor, very draggy, badly wounded glider. His heart sank. The mathematics of glide ratios flashed in his fading mind. A clean P-40 had a glide ratio of about 8:1. From 2,000 feet, he could theoretically glide 3 miles. He was 2 miles out. It was possible, but his P-40 was not clean. It was riddled with bullet holes that disrupted airflow. Its landing gear was down, acting as giant air brakes. His actual glide ratio was closer to 6:1, maybe worse. He was not going to make the runway, after all of it. The battle, the inverted flying, the manual pumping. He would pancake into the jungle scrub, just 200 yards short of safety. The irony was cruel enough to almost make him laugh. Then, in the deep archives of memory, buried under layers of exhaustion and poison, another fragment surfaced. Not from combat, but from training. A casual, almost theoretical remark from an old instructor during a long classroom session on emergency procedures. "The book says the glide ratio is 8:1, the instructor had said, but that's upright. There's some wind tunnel chatter, never tried it, mind you, that if you get desperate, really desperate, an inverted glide can sometimes give you less drag. The wing camber works in reverse. It's a Hail Mary. You'd have to be out of your mind to try it on approach." Philip Adair was, by every definition, out of his mind. He was also out of options. At 800 feet, 1 mile from the threshold, he took a last look at the jungle rushing up, then rolled the P-40 inverted for what he prayed would be the final time. The world flipped. Blood roared to his head with a vengeance, the gray tunnel of his vision flashing red. He was now hanging in his straps, watching the runway slide past, above him, the jungle a terrifying ceiling. He focused on the airspeed, 125 mph. The descent rate, 500 feet per minute. It was better. Marginally, but measurably better than the 700 FPM he'd been experiencing right side up. The theory was correct. The inverted airframe, with its gear bizarrely extended toward the sky, was slicing through the air with slightly less resistance. On the ground, chaos erupted. Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez, a crew chief, watched through his binoculars and froze. An inverted P-40 with gear down was not on any checklist. His first trained thought was sabotage, a captured aircraft on a strafing run. "Jap in a P-40!" he bellowed, dropping his binoculars and sprinting towards a sandbagged .50 caliber machine gun nest. 3 other ground crew followed, piling into the position. Martinez grabbed the grips, his finger slipping into the trigger guard, traversing the heavy weapon to track the approaching, impossible aircraft. The inverted Warhawk filled his sights. It was smoking, damaged, definitely enemy. Or was it? The gear was down. Who made a strafing run with gear down? In the cockpit, Adair's consciousness was a flickering candle. The combined assault of carbon monoxide and negative Gs was shutting down his brain. He had perhaps 20 seconds of coherent thought left. He had to roll upright, align with the runway, and land. All in one fluid motion he was no longer physically capable of. At 200 feet of altitude, a mere 300 yards from the runway's threshold, he made his move. He rolled right side up. The damaged controls immediately reasserted their malign will. The right wing dropped hard. The nose plunged. He fought back with a savage pull on the stick and a boot full of left rudder, muscles he didn't know he had firing in a final screaming protest. The wings leveled unevenly. The nose came up, but not enough. The P-40 was descending at a terrifying nose-high angle, like a wounded bird falling out of the sky. In the gun nest, Martinez tracked the wobbling, smoking aircraft. It was crossing the perimeter fence. It was definitely going to land, or crash. A friendly pilot would never have approached inverted. But an enemy wouldn't land at all. In the 3 seconds it took for the Warhawk to cross the threshold, Martinez made his decision. He took his finger off the trigger. "Hold fire," he screamed. "Hold fire." Adair crossed the runway threshold at 90 feet, descending too fast, too steep. He had no energy, no flair, no control left for finesse. He cut the mixture to kill any chance of fire and braced. The main wheels hit the concrete with a deafening, catastrophic crunch. The impact, later estimated at over 7 Gs, drove the landing gear struts up into their wells. The tail wheel slammed down. The tortured right main gear, likely damaged in the fight, collapsed instantly. The right wing dropped, and its tip gouged into the runway surface with a shriek of tearing metal. Lulu Bell ground-looped violently to the right, spinning 180 degrees in a shower of sparks and fragmented concrete, skidding backwards for 200 feet before lurching to a final, twisted stop. Dust and smoke billowed around the wreck. Silence for 12 long seconds. Then the cockpit canopy, already open, framed movement. A figure moving slowly, released his harness, and stood unsteadily on the seat. Philip Adair climbed out onto the scarred, bullet-riddled wing. His legs gave way immediately. He caught himself on the wing root, his body trembling with exhaustion and toxic shock. Ground crew reached him then, helping him down onto the solid, blessed, unmoving earth. Martinez and the fire crew arrived, hoses at the ready. They opened the cowling. The sight that greeted them was one of mechanical apocalypse. The Allison engine was a solidified mass of melted and seized components. pistons were welded to cylinder walls. The crankshaft was visibly warped. The oil pan was ruptured. Coolant and oil formed a foul lake beneath the aircraft. It was impossible that this engine had produced power for the last 15 minutes. Yet, it had. Adair, leaning on a mechanic, walked a slow circle around Lulu Bell. The tally of damage was a map of his battle. 16 bullet holes in the fuselage, 7 in the right wing, 4 in the left. The right aileron cable was completely severed. A round had punctured the hydraulic reservoir. Another had sliced through the main electrical conduit. The airplane was not repairable. It was a relic, a testament. But it had done its job. Intelligence confirmed it later that day. All 24 Sally bombers had turned back without dropping a single bomb. The Japanese formation had scattered 15 miles short of Denjan. 40 Oscars had escorted empty bombers home. On the ground, 0 casualties, 0 damage. 14 C-47s flew their missions that afternoon. The Hump airlift never missed a beat. 3 days later, at 10th Air Force Headquarters, debriefing officers listened in stunned silence as a still-pale Second Lieutenant Adair described his engagement. Flight surgeons examined him. His blood carbon monoxide levels remained dangerously elevated 72 hours later. They concluded he had flown the final phase of the mission in a state that should have rendered him comatose. On January 8, 1944, Lieutenant General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell himself pinned the Silver Star on Philip Adair's chest. The citation spoke of gallantry in action and single-handedly disrupting a formation of 64 enemy aircraft. It was a formal understatement for an act of transcendent defiance. Adair would fly 95 more combat missions, become an ace with 5 confirmed kills, and survive the war, retiring as a full colonel in 1971. The P-40 Warhawk, often overshadowed by the Mustang and Thunderbolt, never achieved their fame. It was, by 1943, obsolete. But on December 13, 1943, over the jungles of Assam, obsolescence did not matter. Specifications did not matter. All that mattered was the relentless will of one man who refused to accept the arithmetic of his doom. Philip Adair proved that courage, fused with ingenuity and an intimate understanding of his machine, could rewrite the rules of the possible. His inverted odyssey was more than a landing. It was a lesson etched in smoke and courage, that the most powerful weapon in any conflict is not the technology at hand, but the unconquerable human spirit that wields it. The impossible is only so until someone refuses to quit. The cockpit of Lulu Bell had become an oven. The stink of scorched metal, cordite, and hot oil a permanent blanket in the air. Philip Adair's world was now defined by 3 relentless, converging pressures. The screaming needles on his instrument panel, the angular shadows of enemy fighters carving the sky around him, and the slow, terrible advance of the bomber formation on the horizon. The coolant temperature gauge was his personal countdown timer, 240 degrees Fahrenheit. He could feel the change in the engine's voice, a harder, more metallic vibration threading through the familiar roar, a hint of strain, like a man pushing past his absolute limit. 2 Oscars broke from the swirling pack, opting for a head-on pass. It was a brutal psychological tactic, a test of nerves. Closing speed would exceed 600 miles per hour. In the blur of the approach, details snapped into hyperclarity. The dark streak of the cockpit canopy, the distinctive tapered wings, the bright red Hinamaru. At 500 yards, both Japanese fighters winked with muzzle flashes. Their 7.7mm rounds, less powerful than his 50 cals but deadly in volume, reached out first, strings of glowing tracers walking toward his propeller arc. Adair didn't flinch. He held his course for a heart-stopping second longer, letting his heavier, higher-velocity ammunition do the work. At 350 yards, he fired a concentrated 1-second burst. His tracers, slower and brighter, converged on the lead Oscar's engine cowling. The effect was different from the bombers. There was no fireball, but a sudden, violent shudder that racked the lightweight frame. A plume of white vapor, superheated coolant, erupted from the punctured radiator. The Oscar's nose yawed violently left, breaking off the attack, its wingman following in a defensive slide. Adair rolled right and dove again, stealing another few seconds of life. But the maneuver cost him. The violent engine demand spiked the coolant temperature. The needle jumped, quivering at 248 degrees. Now a new sensation transmitted through the control stick, a rough, rhythmic pounding deep within the engine's heart. Detonation. The fuel-air mixture was exploding unevenly in the overheated cylinders, a prelude to catastrophic failure. Metal was expanding, tolerances vanishing. He had seconds, maybe a minute, before a piston welded itself to a cylinder wall or a connecting rod snapped. His eyes darted between the gauges in the sky. The Sally bombers were 15 miles from target. 2 groups of 6 had stubbornly reformed into ragged bombing Vs. The third group was still scattered, 3 lone aircraft struggling to find the formation. The calculus was immediate and cruel. The scattered ones didn't matter. He had to break the organized groups, the ones still capable of a coordinated strike. Ignoring the Oscars now positioning above him for another diving attack, he committed to one final definitive pass. He shoved the throttle, already against the stop, as if he could will more power into the straining Allison. He dove past a diving Oscar show tie, his speed once again bleeding off their angle. At bomber altitude, he leveled out, the airframe trembling, and lined up on the lead Sally of the most intact formation. He had 400 rounds left. He used half of them. The burst was precise, brutal, and final. The 50 caliber rounds walked from the bomber's right wing route out along the spar. The Chi-21's lightweight construction, its great weakness, now proved its undoing. The wing's main structural member failed with a violence he could almost hear over the engine's roar. The entire outer wing panel, from the engine nacelle outward, folded upward at a grotesque angle, then tore clean off in a whirlwind of shredded aluminum and fabric. The bomber, asymmetrical and doomed, rolled onto its back and entered a flat, spinning descent into the jungle below. No parachutes emerged. The crew was gone. This final spectacular kill broke the raid's spirit. The remaining formations dissolved, not just scattering, but now turning decisively away, heading southeast, back toward Burma. The bombing run was aborted. The threat to Denjan was over. But Philip Adair's battle was just entering its most desperate phase. He pulled up into a climb, seeking altitude, the pilot's safety net. As the nose rose, the coolant gauge needle vanished past 250, the end of its scale. A second later, steam, thick and white, began jetting from the seams of his engine cowling. A terrible hollow clunk reverberated through the airframe, followed by a rapid drop in oil pressure. The Allison was dying, its internal organs succumbing to the heat. Then the Oscars, seeing his distress, struck with final vengeful precision. 8 of them dove from the sun. Adair, his attention split between his dying engine and the fleeing bombers, saw them late. He rolled left. He was too slow. A storm of 7.7mm fire ripped into his right wing. The sound was a rapid, sickening thump, 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 thump of metal tearing metal. Fabric on the aileron shredded. A control cable, taut as a piano wire, snapped with a twang he felt in the pedals. The right aileron went limp, then flopped to its full deflection. The wing dropped violently. He fought it with left stick, muscle against failing hydraulics. Another burst walked up the fuselage behind the cockpit. Rounds sparked off the engine firewall. One found its mark. There was a distinct ping, followed by a horrifying, pressurized hiss. Green ethylene glycol coolant, the lifeblood of his engine, erupted from a punctured line behind the instrument panel, spraying in a jet across his windscreen, turning the world into a smeared, opaque nightmare. The engine temperature gauge, its needle now useless, was the least of his concerns. The steam from the cowling turned to smoke, then to licks of orange flame. Fire on a liquid-cooled engine followed a predictable, terrifying sequence. First, the leaking coolant, vaporized by the inferno in the cylinders, ignited. The flames would follow the airflow forward along the cowling. If they reached the main fuel lines running along the engine's left side, the remaining aviation gas in the lines would turn Lulubelle into a mid-air explosion. The manual was unequivocal. Immediate engine shutdown, dive to blow out the flames, and bail out. Adair looked at his altimeter. 8,000 feet, descending. He looked at the jungle below, hostile, impenetrable, patrolled. Bailout meant capture, torture, a prison camp at best. The memory of the wounded at Denjan, of the untouched C-47s flashed in his mind. He had given them safety. He would not give the enemy himself. With a calm that bordered on madness, he did the opposite of procedure. He kept the engine running. His left hand found the red mixture control lever. He pulled it all the way back to idle cutoff, starving the burning engine of fuel. For 3 endless seconds, the engine coughed, spluttered, and the flames subsided into a smolder, starved of combustibles. He shoved the mixture back to auto-rich. The Allison gasped, caught again with a jarring series of backfires, and kept running. But now it was a wounded animal. The power output dropped to maybe 40%. The propeller RPM sagged. He had no climb left. Level flight was a struggle. He was now a pilot without options, flying a glider with a noisy, burning anchor attached. He turned southwest, toward the distant safety of Nguli, 43 miles away. 6 Oscars, their ammunition likely low, formed a grim honor guard behind and above him, following. They no longer attacked. They watched. They waited for the inevitable. At 7,000 feet, the final mechanical death knell sounded. The oil pressure gauge needle, which had been flickering, dropped to 0. The engine could run for moments without coolant on momentum alone, but without oil pressure, it was a dead man walking. Metal ground on metal. The vibration intensified, a bone-shaking judder that made the instrument panel a blur. The propeller began to windmill unevenly, seizing and releasing. His airspeed bled away. 180 mph, then 170. The P-40's stall speed was around 120. The margin between controlled flight and a tumble into the jungle was evaporating as fast as his fuel. One of the Oscars, curious or contemptuous, slid alongside him, so close Adair could see the pilot's leather-helmeted head turn to look. The Japanese pilot pointed 2 fingers downward at the jungle, then made a sharp, cutting gesture across his throat. The message was universal. Land. surrender. Adair looked straight ahead through his coolant-streaked windshield, ignoring him. The Oscar held position for a moment, then peeled away. The decision had been made. They would let the jungle, or the physics of failure, finish the job. They climbed higher, becoming silent observers to his dying struggle. Then, at 6,000 feet, a new, more intimate enemy attacked. Acrid white smoke began to curl from behind the shattered instrument panel, not from the engine fire, but from burning electrical wiring severed by the fuselage hits. It filled the cockpit, stinging his eyes, clawing at his throat. He gagged, fumbling with gloved hands to slide the canopy open. The hurricane-force slipstream tore in, clearing the smoke, but stealing his breath, roaring in his ears with the voice of the coming storm. He was alone, poisoned, trapped in a disintegrating machine, with 43 miles of unforgiving jungle between him and home. The battle against the Japanese was over. Now, the battle against gravity, physics, and his own failing body had begun.